13 of the 15 locks along the most critical water route in North America are under Canadian ownership. 13 out of 15. These massive steel and concrete structures raise ocean-going vessels from the Atlantic and move them step by step into the center of the continent. 13 are owned, operated, and administered by Canada on behalf of the Canadian government. The United States controls only 2. This is not a small canal. It is the St. Lawrence Seaway, the primary gateway to the North American interior. This marine transportation corridor extends approximately 3,700 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean into the Great Lakes region. The route reaches 8 American states, more than 100 ports and commercial terminals, 40 highways, and 30 rail corridors. Because of this system, a city such as Duluth, Minnesota, located roughly 2,000 miles from the ocean deep inside North America, is officially considered a seaport. It is also why ocean-going ships can reach Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit, and Chicago. Every year, close to 3,000 vessels carrying about 36 million tons of cargo move through these locks. Midwestern grain travels outward to global markets. Iron ore moves towards steel production centers. Petroleum products, steel, stone, and other industrial materials flow through the system. Together, they form the economic lifeblood of the American industrial heartland. All of that passes through a narrow, human-built channel. And along that channel, 13 of the 15 gates are controlled by Canada. According to one major study, commercial activity tied to this network supports roughly 237,000 jobs and generates about $35 billion in revenue across both countries. For more than a year, Donald Trump has portrayed Canada as the weaker partner in the relationship. Tariffs were imposed on Canadian steel, aluminum, and energy products. Canada was described as dependent on the United States and incapable of thriving without American support. Repeatedly, the same suggestion appeared. Canada, according to the taunt, would be better off becoming the 51st state. That argument depends on a single assumption. Canada needs America for everything, while America has little need for Canada. But there is something often forgotten. Donald Trump was not the first American president to use annexation rhetoric toward Canada. Decades earlier, Dwight D. Eisenhower made a remarkably similar remark. The context was the very same waterway. The negotiations centered on the St. Lawrence Seaway itself, and the outcome was not what many would expect. Canada challenged the American position, financed much of the project, and ultimately emerged owning the overwhelming majority of the infrastructure. The belief that history supports the modern argument overlooks what actually happened. In reality, the historical record points in the opposite direction. To understand why those 13 locks carry such significance, it is necessary to examine the geographic challenge at the center of North America. The continent's agricultural and industrial core is extraordinarily productive, yet much of it is effectively landlocked. The Great Lakes create an inland maritime system, a freshwater expanse surrounded by major cities and industrial centers. However, despite their vast size, the lakes once faced a major obstacle. They lacked a practical deepwater connection to the Atlantic Ocean. Between the lakes and the sea stood powerful natural barriers. West of Montreal, the St. Lawrence River contained dangerous rapids that cargo ships could not navigate safely. Farther upstream stood an even more famous barrier, Niagara Falls. The dramatic drop between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario blocked direct marine passage. Nature had created immense wealth in the middle of the continent. Then it sealed access behind formidable obstacles. For centuries, this challenge remained unresolved. Early French explorers Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain reached the rapids west of Montreal and recognized both the opportunity and the problem. For generations afterward, cargo frequently had to be unloaded, transported around the rapids, and loaded onto vessels once again. Serious proposals for a deepwater seaway appeared as early as the 1890s. Then, progress stalled. For roughly 60 years, very little changed. The reason was straightforward. The United States Congress repeatedly blocked the project. Year after year and decade after decade, lawmakers in Washington refused to approve construction. Railroad interests and East Coast ports opposed the plan because they feared new competition. As a result, historians have described the Seaway as the longest-running unresolved issue in the history of Canada-United States relations. Canada wanted the route completed. For 6 decades, the United States declined to move forward. By the early 1950s, Canadian patience had largely disappeared. The country was experiencing strong economic growth. Large iron ore deposits had been discovered in Labrador. Transporting that ore efficiently to steel mills required improved shipping access through the St. Lawrence. The bottleneck west of Montreal had become a major constraint on Canadian development. In 1951, Prime Minister Louis St. Laurent approached President Harry Truman with a different message. Canada was no longer asking. Instead, St. Laurent made it clear that if the United States chose not to participate, Canada would proceed independently. An entirely Canadian seaway would be built on Canadian territory. Canada would finance it. Canada would control it. The United States could simply observe from across the river. That possibility transformed the situation. Washington feared one outcome more than paying for construction. It feared being excluded from control of the route. The prospect of the gateway to the Great Lakes existing almost entirely under Canadian authority was unacceptable. Suddenly, after 60 years of resistance, enthusiasm emerged. In 1954, during Eisenhower's administration, Congress finally approved legislation supporting a joint project with Canada. That August, near Cornwall, Ontario, construction officially began. At the time, it was considered the largest construction undertaking on Earth. It was during these negotiations that a moment occurred which still echoes today. After joining the project, American negotiators increasingly behaved as though they held primary ownership over it. Lionel Chevrier, one of Canada's principal ministers involved in the negotiations, later wrote that American representatives acted as though they were carrying out the entire undertaking themselves. During discussions, President Eisenhower addressed Chevrier directly. He remarked that Canada would be better off becoming the 49th state. At that time, Alaska and Hawaii had not yet entered the Union. The statement mirrored modern annexation rhetoric almost word for word. The same idea, the same tactic, and it was delivered during negotiations concerning this exact waterway. Eisenhower paired the comment with a specific demand. He wanted complete American control over the vital international rapids section of the river. Canada did not yield. There was no panic, there was no pleading. Ottawa responded calmly. If the United States insisted on controlling that section, Canada would construct its own canal and its own locks on Canadian territory and redirect shipping through them. It was the same strategy St. Laurent had previously presented to Truman. Build it independently. Control it independently. Faced with that possibility, the United States backed away from its position. Whether it was a bluff or not, the approach succeeded once again. Canada had grasped the most crucial lesson in dealing with a domineering partner. When pressure is applied, the solution is not to plead, it is to construct your own gateway. What came next was among the largest engineering feats in human history. At the time, the St. Lawrence Seaway and Power Project was the biggest construction endeavor on Earth. The crews moved more earth and rock than was excavated for the Suez Canal. The project employed the most advanced techniques of its era, including the first computer ever brought into Canada. The cost was not measured only in money. To create the navigation channel and the hydroelectric reservoir behind the dam at Cornwall, engineers flooded an area equivalent to Manhattan, displacing its residents. Along Ontario's St. Lawrence shore lay a series of small, historic communities, some dating back to the 1700s, 6 villages and 3 hamlets, over 500 homes, 6,500 residents, farms cultivated for generations, churches, cemeteries, schools, all in the path of rising waters. People were relocated, some homes literally lifted onto trailers and moved. 64-kilometer of railway track and 56-kilometer of highway were shifted. In July of 1958, engineers breached the cofferdam, and the water surged. Within 3 days and 3 nights, the communities vanished beneath the new lake. Canadians still refer to them as the Lost Villages. Divers today can see their foundations and sidewalks, ghost streets beneath the cold waters of the Seaway. This was Canada's price in land and memory to build the continent's front door. A year later, on the 26th of June, 1959, the Seaway officially opened in one of the century's grandest ceremonies. Queen Elizabeth II, representing Canada, and President Dwight D. Eisenhower stood together, declared the Seaway open, and then boarded the royal yacht Britannia, sailing through the locks together. 2 months earlier, a Canadian Coast Guard icebreaker had become the first vessel to pass through. Picture that moment. A queen and a president aboard one ship gliding through gates carved from rock and rapids by their 2 nations. Whatever disputes had flared during negotiations, the completed Seaway stood as the greatest physical symbol of partnership between the United States and Canada, common ground flowing with shared water. The engineering itself is remarkable. The Seaway functions as a staircase for ships. Between Montreal and Lake Erie, 15 massive locks lift ocean-going vessels a total of 557 feet, roughly 170 meters. Ships up to 740 feet long, longer than 2 football fields, enter a concrete chamber. Gates close behind them, and gravity-fed valves fill the chamber until the ship rises like a toy in a bathtub. Each lock takes approximately 45 minutes before the vessel proceeds to the next. By the time ships reach the upper lakes, they float more than 180 meters above sea level, the equivalent of a 60-story building. The Seaway carries ships up a skyscraper of water. The steepest stretch is the Welland Canal, where 8 locks raise vessels 99 meters vertically along the Niagara Escarpment, right past Niagara Falls. Returning to the original number, who controls the 15 locks from Montreal to Lake Ontario? 7 are American. 5 of those are Canadian. 2, near Messina, New York, belong to the United States. The Welland Canal, all 8 locks of it, is entirely Canadian, running through Canadian territory. In total, 13 of the 15 locks on the St. Lawrence Seaway are Canadian, managed by the St. Lawrence Seaway Management Corporation for the Canadian government. The arithmetic is striking. America's 2 locks sit in the middle, flanked by Canadian locks. Alone, they connect to nothing. A ship passing through them cannot reach the ocean or the upper lakes without passing through Canadian gates. Strategically, the American locks are 2 doors in the center of a Canadian hallway. Why does Canada control so much? Because Canada built it, and Canada paid for it. When the final bills were tallied, Canada had spent $336.5 million on the Seaway versus America's $133.8 million. Canada financed roughly 75% of the entire navigation project. 3/4 of the front door to America's industrial heartland was funded by the neighbor that Washington had blocked for 60 years and mocked at the negotiating table. Ownership of those 13 locks is no accident. It is Canada's receipt for calling the bluff, doing the work, drowning its villages, and writing the check. Consider what flows through that Canadian-controlled gateway today. Grain from the American Midwest moves from ports like Duluth and Toledo to the Atlantic and global markets. Iron ore and steel feed the industrial belt, petroleum products, stone, machinery. About 2 billion tons of cargo have passed through the Seaway since its opening, worth hundreds of billions of dollars. 8 American states border this system. More than 100 ports operate on it. 237,000 jobs on both sides depend on the commerce it carries. When a farmer in Minnesota sells wheat to Europe, or a mill ships steel, that cargo likely rises and falls through chambers whose gates are opened by Canadian hands under Canadian law on Canadian soil. This is the system Donald Trump spent a year attempting to disrupt. His tariffs targeted the very goods that transit these locks. 50% on steel and aluminum, levies on Canadian energy, threats against Canadian grain and manufacturing. Alongside economic measures came repeated taunts. Canada is weak, Canada freeloads, Canada should become the 51st state. Every claim rests on the same assumption Eisenhower confronted 70 years ago. Canada holds no leverage and dependence runs only south to north. That assumption has failed repeatedly under scrutiny. Bridges, uranium, potash, aluminum, water, every single time. The Seaway may be the most poetic example. Trump never considered the locks. 13 of 15. Let that sink in. The front door of the American heartland turns on Canadian hinges. Every ocean-going ship destined for Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Duluth. Every vessel carrying Midwest grain to the world must pass through Canadian-controlled gates. Not gates Canada influences, not gates Canada votes on, but gates owned by Canada, on Canadian territory, built with Canadian money. The United States could not move a single cargo ship from the Atlantic into its Great Lakes ports tomorrow without Canadian cooperation. There is no alternative, no second channel, no plan B. Geography offered only one staircase into the heart of the continent, and 3/4 of it by cost, and 13 of 15 locks bears a maple leaf. The historical irony is almost theatrical. Donald Trump's 51st state taunt is a replay. The original aired in the 1950s, delivered by Eisenhower over this very waterway as a negotiating pressure tactic. How did that story conclude? Canada answered by reaching for its checkbook and its shovels. It said, "Fine, we will build it ourselves." The credibility of that threat broke 60 years of American stonewalling in just 3 years. The president who joked about annexing Canada ended up sailing through Canadian-owned locks at the opening ceremony as a guest. If Trump had studied even a single chapter of this history, he would know pushing Canada does not make it fold. It makes it build. It made Canada construct the Seaway in the 1950s. And, as recent developments show, it is making Canada build again in the Arctic at the port of Churchill. Another door America does not control. The pattern is 70 years old and Trump is feeding it rather than opposing it. What can Canada actually do with those 13 locks? Let me be precise. Canada has never threatened to close the Seaway. Not once, not even during the darkest weeks of the trade war, and almost certainly never will. Yet, in a confrontation, a card does not have to be played to shift the balance. Its existence alone changes the game. Anyone looking at the map can see it. A small preview appeared in October of 2023 when a labor strike shut the Canadian locks for about a week over a routine wage dispute. The alarm was immediate. Shipping froze. Farmers in the prairies and Midwest saw their export window narrow. Politicians in Ontario and Great Lakes states made urgent calls. 1 week of closed Canadian locks reminded everyone what those gates truly are. Imagine that lever in a real economic conflict. The smartest in Washington go quiet when this topic comes up. That said, the sword cuts both ways. Canada depends on the Seaway as much as America does. The same strike that alarmed the Midwest also alarmed Saskatchewan and Manitoba because prairie farmers move grain to global markets through the same locks. Industry in Ontario and Quebec relies on that water. The steel mills of Hamilton sit on it. If Canada ever closed the seaway as a weapon, it would be harming itself as much as its neighbor. A deeper cost remains. Canada's strategy in this trade war, advocated by Mark Carney in New York and Europe, rests on one principle. Canada is stable, predictable, a partner that honors agreements even when provoked. Weaponizing the seaway would destroy that reputation in a single afternoon. The lock gates are real leverage, but leverage to hold, not leverage to use. The seaway today is not the roaring artery it once was. Traffic peaked at over 57 million tons in 1977. Today it moves around 36 million. The container revolution shifted much cargo to coastal megaports. The seaway freezes in winter when ice covers the river. It remains crucial for grain, ore, and steel. But it is one artery among several, not the only one. Claims that Canada could strangle the American economy via the Welland Canal are exaggerated. The point is narrower and more interesting. Who owns the door, regardless of usage? That is the real story. Not a threat, but a deed. Strip away tariffs and taunts. Ask the question property lawyers ask. Who holds title? The most important piece of shared infrastructure on the continent, the front door of the American heartland, is overwhelmingly titled to Canada. America's access to its inland sea exists at the pleasure of a partnership. A partnership Washington ignored for 60 years, joined late, paid a quarter of, and now has spent over a year insulting. Trump treats Canada like a tenant in America's building. The St. Lawrence Land Registry tells a different story. Remember June of 1959, a queen and a president on the royal yacht, sailing through brand new locks as crowds cheered. Beneath the water lay the drowned streets of the lost villages, the price one country paid to build a doorway shared by both. That generation understood something the present moment has forgotten. The greatest infrastructure is not concrete or steel, it is trust. The seaway works because two countries, after 60 years of suspicion, decided to bind their economies with water and honor that promise for 70 years. The concrete is the receipt. Trust is the asset. Trust, once destroyed, cannot be rebuilt with a signing ceremony. What stays with me is not the leverage. As vast as it is the echo. 70 years apart, two American presidents made the same annexation joke, assuming the quiet neighbor with a smaller economy would accept the terms given. The first time, Canada answered without raising its voice. It made clear it was prepared to build and own the door alone. It ended up owning 13 of 15 locks on the American heartland's lifeline. Today, Canada responds the same way, not with threats, but with construction. A port in the Arctic, new partners in Europe, capital raised on Wall Street. Nations remember how they won the last round, even if opponents ignored the lesson. Trump spent a year threatening his northern neighbor without checking who owns the locks. 13. It has never been a secret. In plain sight for 67 years, one short boat ride from the New York border. America's front door swings on Canadian hinges. It has since 1959. The quietest, most enduring power is not the loudest threat or the largest tariff. It is simply owning what your rival forgot to check. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.